welcome to the IoT Podcast Cybersecurity Mini-Series Special. I'm your host, Katie White, Head of Research and Partnerships at the IoT Podcast, powered by 5E Media. Today I'm joined by Richard Marshall, Founder and Director at Xitex and Plenary Chair at the IoT Security Foundation. In the episode, we discuss the major shifts in the security landscape. We explore the increasing availability of low-cost chips with really great embedded security and how this is enabling companies to build more secure products easier. We also discuss the rise of state actors engaging in device hacking and the consequential implications for the future of cybersecurity.
So, Richard, welcome to the IoT Podcast. It's great to have you here today. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background and what you do, please?
Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity, Katie. Really delighted to be on this podcast today. So my background is a little bit mixed, primarily telecoms in the 3G, 4G era, culminating in being involved with one of the major startups in the small, they were called femtocell, but essentially small base stations. And that's where I got a lot of my experience in cybersecurity, but also formerly in consumer electronics for a number of major companies, but particularly around set-top box, which of course has always been very security focused, because obviously media companies want to protect their rights. So set-top boxes have always been, by their very definition, fairly secure, because you can imagine the major film companies really don't want people suddenly copying content out of their set-top box. But more recently, the particular startup Ubiquitous that I was involved with got bought by Cisco in 2013. And then more recently, I've gone back to doing consultancy. It's my own consultancy, but very much really building on all of that experience, culminating in 2016, becoming the first plenary chair of the IoTSF, and one of the lead authors of the Foundation's assurance framework. And so that was very much the lead on, as it were, then to more recently getting more involved with helping companies with cybersecurity, particularly IoT, and particularly some of the challenges around mass scaling. Historically, in the past, what's tended to happen is a lot of companies are familiar with doing security for a small number of devices. But when you're trying to deploy millions of devices, particularly secure ones, there's a slightly different set of challenges. So things like, how do you roll out software for multi-millions of devices and do it securely? How do you fix patches? How do you recover things? How do you deal with things that, when they go wrong? And particularly in the consumer space, product recall has always been a sensitive topic. But the idea that you might suddenly do an update and then suddenly find that the devices have gone wrong in some way, typically the kind of boxes, particularly consumer boxes, you can't have a mass recall because the cost would just be out of all proportion. So there's some of those things that go with some of the challenges of security. So that's perhaps a little bit about my background.
Yeah. And so you said you joined IoT SF in 2016 as one of the founding members. So is there any major shifts that you've seen in the security landscape from 2016? Because obviously that was when IoT, for a lot of people, when it was making more of its emergence.
Very much so, because at the time when the foundation was formed, going back to the original first inaugural meeting at Bletchley Park, was the fact that at that point there was very little regulation, general regulation, and certainly very little regulation or standardisation for IoT at that time. Hardly surprising, it's a new technology. To where we are today, where there are major moves, particularly in the US, the UK, Europe. There are major cybersecurity activities now going on. So it's quite a different landscape. But the nice thing about it, and I'll touch on this in one of my presentations later today, is the fact that the work that was done in 2016, I'm delighted to say, is standing the test of time. And if folks have followed, companies and organisations have followed the work in the insurance framework, they should find themselves in quite a good space right now.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And so, obviously, 2023 has been quite a big year for IoT. So, in your view, what are some of the biggest innovations that you've seen, but also maybe some of the challenges that you've seen as well, security and beyond?
That's a great question. So, probably one of the biggest things, I'll go back a little bit beyond a year because silicon life cycles are longer than a year. But certainly the availability of low-cost chips with really good embedded security features has really been a trajectory now for the last 3 or 4 years. So there's a lot more silicon available and modules available for which people can, companies can build secure products, which certainly in 2016 was a lot more of a challenge. Vendors would have to have a reasonable grounding in security to be able to put a secure product together. There's a lot more, much more technology and really good technology available now. If we come to some of the challenges side of things, the obvious ones are in terms of, we'll come back to regulation in a second, but in the challenges sense, obviously that there's a change of landscape, and a lot of the initial focus was consumer. But now, of course, unfortunately, with some of the conflicts taking place in the world, that's meant that some of the actors in the I use the term hacking in its loosest sense. Some of the actors have changed. They're not just some of the actors who were necessarily doing it for academic prowess, for example. State actors are now becoming more and more of a concern. So that obviously means that the product manufacturers do now, and governments are obviously becoming a lot more aware of some of the risks and the threats that come with cybersecurity, or more precisely, poor cybersecurity. And obviously, with that, we've seen a big change in the regulation space. The US is obviously one of the major leaders. The Colonial Pipeline attack obviously caused some fairly major thinking in the US government. You've seen the Biden administration, with a number of executive orders. So everything around, just how the federal government does security, but also, some of the obligations on things like transportation and, some of the utilities and things like that. So the US has been pushing ahead, quite rapidly. Similarly, obviously, the UK has been working on, there's been a lot of work in the UK on the consumer side. And we've seen the culmination of that, of course, with the PSTI bill that will go live 29th of April next year. Obviously, that's principally consumer focused, and starts to resolve some things around, the UK government's tried to play nicely and did the code of practice back in 2018 of saying, about vulnerability disclosure. The market's been a little bit slow to pick that up. So that's now obviously becoming mandatory under the PSTI bill. And then, of course, a lot of activity in Europe. The radio equipment directive, so for any manufacturer who's got a wireless device, for example, will already, I'm sure, be familiar with the radio equipment directive. But because there were some articles in the original 2014 directive that were what's termed deprecated, in other words, they weren't enforced, they've now been enabled. And so as a result, there's a standard being produced, or 3 standards being produced by CENELEC. And the original activation date for which those cyber standards will come into force for all radio products was the 1st of August 2024. Slight challenge there was the standard wasn't going to be available till probably June 2024. That date has just been extended. The European Commission has just announced that will be moved by a year to give industry a chance to catch up. But it's probably worth making the point that the standardisation work for this is going on in kind of double time. Typically, harmonised standards take 3 or 4 years. This work's going on with a time frame of 2 years. But that in itself probably tells you just how much emphasis is being made now in terms of pushing forward on cyber regulation, which leads on, of course, to the very big piece of legislation, which is the Cyber Resilience Act. I suspect most people are familiar with that one. Again, another big piece of standardisation work, much bigger than the Radio Equipment Directive. That'll involve something like 30 standards. The standardisation request is being drafted at the minute, and the standardisation work will probably begin in anger in Q1 2024. Expect standards to start coming out 2026, and there'll be an expectation of vendor compliance by 2027. But that will be slightly different to the radio work. The radio work is, because the Radio Equipment Directive is always very much focused on product. I've got a wireless device, I need to certify it. So it's quite tightly bound around equipment. The CRA is much bigger scope. So it's got some of the the types of things that you'll see in the PSTI next year, vulnerability disclosure. So it's much more about not just the product, but what an organisation does in terms of secure development, vulnerability disclosure, etc., etc. So that's probably a long answer to a short question, but hopefully gives you a feel for the the kind of landscape. So a lot happening at the moment.
No, definitely a lot of activity, especially in 2024 as well. I know you mentioned some of the standards coming in a bit later than that, but I think you already slightly answered this, but is there any key things that we can expect to see in 2024, but also how can organisations and companies prepare themselves for these standards that are coming in? Is there any advice that you have?
Absolutely. Certainly for some vendors, hardware, a lot of this software is one thing. Software can be, typically can be changed. You can update software. There are always the corner cases of products that can't be updated in the field. They're a slightly different ball game. But inevitably, for a lot of manufacturers who are in the physical product business, then now's the time. If you're not already doing it, now is the time to start thinking about what implications these regulations are going to have for your hardware, because with hardware development cycles being anything from a year to 2 years in some cases, particularly for heavily regulated products, a longer period of time. So now is very much the time to start thinking about what security requirements need to be baked in for both current products, but also particularly for product roadmap. That's a really important area. But one of the other pieces of advice I would certainly provide is it's easy to see security as purely a product thing. Often what you find is that cybersecurity affects, in most product businesses, it affects the whole organisation. So there's often this view, well, that's a development problem, isn't it? And of course, you've got operations who will have to run, they will have to operate and support the product in the field. Even procurement people have often been surprised, because suddenly now they're being given well, how long do we get cybersecurity support for these? We've bought these modem modules. How long are we going to get patching support for? So and that's a very hot topic right now. So there's very much that kind of those are some of the things. So certainly my advice to any company now is regulations coming, has been for a while. Now's the time to get fit. It's a lot easier to do it on a longer runway than it is if you suddenly find it's like, it's 1st of August, we've got to do it, which certainly on a hardware life cycle is probably problematic.
Thank you so much for those insights, Richard, and some really great advice. So my final question to you today is, obviously we're at the 9th annual IoT Security Foundation conference, and the main theme this year, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of things happening around AI, and the main theme for the conference this year is securing the Internet of Things in the era of artificial intelligence. Is there any key either innovations, challenges, things happening that you could share with us today?
Certainly. AI gets, obviously AI is challenging because technologists are not always the best people to actually see where the technology goes. We've seen that many times. There are always the few exceptions. Steve Jobs obviously springs to mind. But certainly one of the challenges that AI is going to represent, there's kind of two things. We've not touched on it, but obviously there's post-quantum cryptography, which can potentially renders quite a lot of cryptographic ciphers, effectively renders them insecure. But you've now got the challenge, of course, that AI can be used as it can be used in other sectors. Can now start to be used by hackers or attackers. So suddenly then the speed at which, as it were, hackers to be able to attack products or systems or networks has the potential to accelerate. And let's face it, cybersecurity isn't an absolute. The analogy I like to use is when you buy a safe, what are you buying? And people tend to think of security. Well, actually, when you buy a safe, you're buying time. Because usually what the safe manufacturer will guarantee you is how long it'll keep somebody out, but it won't necessarily say that they can't get in indefinitely. So again, cybersecurity has always been a bit of a cat and mouse game. So certainly AI can quite conceivably have an impact on that, in that the mice, as it were, the mice can catch up far more quickly than the cats, if you will. So those would certainly be some things to keep in mind. And again, that combination of post-quantum, potentially by the 2030s, depending on obviously on which who you ask. So those two combinations are going to mean that the likelihood is the speed of change is going to increase.
Well, thank you so much for your insights today, Richard. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to seeing your session later as well. So thank you very much. That is it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.